Lukashenko, unlike Trump, is a slightly kind of buffoonish persona. He says outrageous things. He publicly tells tall tales. Lukashenko famously said that his father died in the Second World War, which, as we all know, ended in 1945. And we also know that he was born in 1954. So that doesn't quite add up, and it's public knowledge. But he didn't stop him from being kind of carried away at a moment of talking about the Second World War and saying this for obvious, not truth.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover.
Today, our guest is Dr. Natalya Chernyshova. She's a historian of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe with a special focus on Belarusian history, amongst other interests. She's a senior lecturer in modern European history at Queen Mary University of London and author of the book Soviet Consumer Culture in the Brezhnev Era. And she's currently completing another book tentatively titled as The Most Soviet Republic, Belarus in the Long 1970s. Great title. Welcome to the Rhyming Chaos, Natalia. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
Thank you, Natalya, and welcome. I'm going to start with trying to situate for our audience and for myself, Belarus. Could you bear with me as I try to summarize Belarusian history in a minute or so? So the area that is Belarus today was inhabited and controlled by various Slavic tribes and Vikings until about the 14th century, when it was absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and subsequently by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Then from 1792 to 1795, this territory was carved up between Austria, Prussia, and the Russian Empire. And today's Belarus fell to Russia, and Belarus has never really escaped the Russian orbit since then. In the 20th century, it was part of the Soviet Union. And for the 21st century so far, it's been something of a vassal state or a subordinate state to Putin's Russia. And to go back a bit, Belarus gained independence in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Alexander Lukashenko became president in 1994 in an election and has maintained authoritarian rule ever since, keeping close ties with Russia and having bad to worse relations with the US and the European Union. Lukashenko abolished presidential term limits in 2004, so it looks like Belarus is stuck with him for some time to come. The country's faced some international isolation, particularly following discredited elections and crackdowns on opposition protests in 2020, which we'll talk about in this podcast. But neither domestic nor international opposition seems to have deterred Lukashenko. So let me just conclude this summary with a few words about him. He seems to have grown up in a humble village, apparently with a single mother. He became a Soviet soldier, Communist Party member, and then director of a state farm, beginning a rise through the Soviet hierarchy. And he parlayed this experience and his connections and a popular campaign against official corruption to become Belarus's first democratically elected president in 1994. But subsequent elections have been called shams by foreign observers and Belarusians themselves. And Lukashenko represses political opponents, media, universities, etc. And he likes a good military parade. What did I get wrong or miss out, Natalya? And how would you characterize Lukashenko's rule today?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I think you got most things right. This is an excellent introduction, squeezing a long and complicated history in a few seconds. I think maybe one theme I would probably take slight issue with is the extent to which Belarus has been a vassal to Russia since its independence. It certainly had close ties culturally, socially, economically, and politically. And I think it's accurate to say it was also Lukashenko's regime in particular has been dependent on Russian economic support. And most recently, since 2020, on its political support. But if the Lukashenko regime has been a vassal, it's been a very awkward vassal that constantly quarrels with its master and constantly tries to wriggle out of certain obligations to Russia. So the relationship has been quite rocky at times. And in fact, the interesting point about the 2020 protests is that just before the elections over which these protests emerged, the relationship between Russia and Belarus was at all-time low. And it seemed like finally Belarus would wean itself away from Russia, but things did not work out that way. And we can talk about that in the podcast later.
Lukashenko doesn't seem very charismatic today, but he's written about, certainly news reports, as somewhat charismatic during his populist rise to power. How do you see his personality and his media presence as a factor in his ongoing grip on power?
I think it's been quite important. It's been key. I mean, he's very much a populist politician. Politicals of ideas, political ideologies are very much secondary to him. He wants to not just hold on to power, but he wants to be liked. And I think he always was like that. Funny enough, I found quite a lot of similarities between Lukashenko and Trump in terms of their kind of arrival to power and leadership style and the role of personality in their politics. So Lukashenko, unlike Trump, is a slightly kind of buffoonish persona. He says outrageous things. He publicly tells tall tales. Lukashenko famously said that his father died in the Second World War, which, as we all know, ended in 1945. And we also know that he was born in 1954. So that doesn't quite add up, and it's public knowledge. But he didn't stop him from being kind of carried away at a moment of talking about the Second World War and saying this for obvious, not truth. So both have this kind of TV showman manner and they get carried away, work the audience like a showman, right? And then can change the position abruptly when political moment changes.
Sorry to interrupt you, Natalia. Just one of the things I remember from some videos I've watched of Lukashenko, also I teach quite a bit about him in my course on authoritarian politics, is how he does everything himself. He's got this very handy manner, like he's able to cut down trees and like do all the agricultural stuff. And he can meet with leaders and he's able to talk to high level, low level, everybody. He's kind of like very accessible, and the propaganda puts him as this really, like you said, it's a very populist leader, but also just like a hands-on kind of like everyday leader. And I guess Trump has a little bit of that, but I found Lukashenko to be more striking when it comes to that kind of people's appeal, or like the way that he positions himself as being able to do everything with his hands. Is that something that you've noticed as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, he always stressed him being part of the people, like of the people from the outset. When he first came on the scene and when he first began running for the president back in 1994, he was a complete dark horse, so a surprise candidate. He was a member of the Supreme Council then, which was the Belarusian parliament at the time, but he was not part of the establishment. He was very much an outsider. He was a former head of the state farm, of the collective farm, so he was not seriously a bit of a provincial, like a bumpkin. No one expected him to win. But like Trump much later, he played this card of being a political outsider extremely well. He said he knew what people wanted. He didn't care about left-right politics. He just wanted to give to the people what they wanted. And when he said stupid things publicly, it didn't matter because it was a mark of his authenticity. So he kind of siphoned this public dissatisfaction with the establishment. In the parliament, as you said, he had, or headed rather, an anti-corruption commission. So he could talk about corruption and really play on suspicions of elite corruption, which were widespread, uncertainties about the collapse of the Soviet economic structures. And he was pitted mainly against the old Soviet apparatchik turned Democrat in these elections, in the first presidential elections Belarus had in 1994. And therefore, these kind of populist persona, diamond in the rough kind of characteristics really worked well, as opposed to this smooth talking, nicely dressed, smart, and very much establishment figure of Vyacheslav Kebich, who was this old Soviet apparatchik. Lukashenko was really good at kind of firing up his social base, his so-called budgetniki, the people who were employed in state enterprises, who were anxious about arrival of market capitalism, the loss of state paternalism. And this is why the Soviet legacy is very important, of course. Belarusians did very well out of the last Soviet decades. So Lukashenko really used that well, and he continued to use this sort of popular persona. He's still chopping wood on television, right? And he's still kind of showing how he's very much the man of the people. But it's no longer seemed to be working. That's the problem. But even when he first arrived, Lukashenko divided Belarus very sharply. There was a complete chasm between those who voted for him and those who just could not see themselves voting for him again. A lot of parallels I find here with the US and the divisions.
And you write a lot about the importance of considering the legacies of the Soviet Union in thinking about contemporary political realities in Belarus. How can Soviet legacies explain the enduring leadership of Lukashenko? So we know about his charm and about his appeal to the people, but what about the Soviet legacies that also help him or potentially root him in this very long-standing leadership role?
This link between Soviet legacy and authoritarianism has been highlighted often. And usually the kind of explanation goes along this line. Well, Belarus fell victim to Lukashenko because it was the most Soviet republic back in the Soviet times. It was so oppressed, it was so denationalized, it was so kind of loyal to the Soviet regime that it was just ripe for a takeover by another authoritarian leader. He just dangled before Belarusian society this carrot of Soviet nostalgia, and boom, they were gone. They were sold. I think this picture is a little bit simplistic. It's not outright wrong, but it's missing some important pieces of the puzzle. The Soviet legacy is hugely relevant, but I think its influence is a little more complex. So we know that most Belarusians were indeed very reluctant to leave the Soviet Union when it disintegrated. There was a referendum that showed early in 1991 that about 83 or more percent, I can't remember, but in the 80s, wanted to preserve some form and shape of the Soviet Union. And then people were apprehensive what would come next, and Lukashenko played on those sentiments very directly. But I think we should ask why Belarusians were so wedded to the Soviet project. And it's not that they were especially oppressed, or certainly not in the post-war half of the Soviet period, not more than other republics. A much more convincing answer, I think, is that they benefited from the economic development in the decades after the Second World War. So Belarus was not only rebuilt after what was an apocalyptic destruction of the war, but it also received huge investments from the center to industrialize, and it did so very effectively. So within a couple of decades, it became this hugely successful industrial republic, a flagship of Soviet modernity, of Soviet kind of economic model, socialist model. It was extracting oil, it was producing computers, it had a nuclear research center. So it was a completely different republic after the Second World War, and especially in the 70s, right? And living standards improved a lot. So quality of life improved enormously in the 1970s. So this is a society that did rather well out of the Soviet economic and state paternalism before perestroika. And it became a source of considerable national pride, as well as the Belarusian war myth, which celebrated its contribution to the Soviet victory in the second. But I stress the word national because this links to another assumption about Belarus, that they have a weak sense of national identity. And I think this also fails to appreciate its complexity because it focuses on one type of national identity, the one that is in opposition to the Soviet identity. Whereas in Belarus, because of its economic and social achievements of the post-war period, this national identity exists together with the Soviet identity. It's mixed, it's very closely entangled. And so when the Soviet Union disintegrated, this kind of extraction from socialism is a much greater challenge in Belarus than in many other ex-Soviet neighbors. So going back to the Lukashenko victory and the establishment of his regime, nationalist democratic politicians made a mistake in the early 1990s, unfortunately, is that they rejected the Soviet identity and they wanted society to reject it wholesale and instead embrace something else, national identity.
It's a little bit similar to Russia in some ways, right? When there was such a drastic shift towards pro-market and pro-Western transformation. And then in the end, like there was also a huge rejection of some of these very fast-moving shifts.
Absolutely. And often Lukashenko pointed to Russia and say, look what's going on here, and we're safe from that, right? Like they have this crony capitalism, this kind of bandit capitalism, and we don't. We're okay. And that's because we hold on to this legacy. The nice memory of recent Soviet years meant that Belarusians struggled to kind of embrace this purely national, non-Soviet identity. But Lukashenko grasped this very well. And just like Trump, he tapped into this discontent of the voters who felt remote from the electoral agenda set, for example, of Democrats. And his big winning card in his first elections was this very public respect for Soviet legacy, for war memory, but also for state paternalism. So he promised, state ownership to a lot of enterprises, which meant no unemployment, safety from inflation, social benefits, dignity in living conditions. So all of that was there. But the problem was that over time, his ability to maintain even the facade of this social contract disintegrated, and this contributed to the protests in 2020.
Is this disintegration mainly economic in terms of not being able to deliver on these promises, or is the more kind of symbolic disintegration, was that also taking place, like this kind of connection with the Soviet legacies, because that kind of eventually started to fade for people as they started to get discontented with economic prospects?
I think, yeah, it's a little bit of both. I mean, the economy is very important, but it's also a little bit more than just the economy. What Lukashenko promised to his electorate was to give people dignity. Dignity in terms of being protected from poverty, from unemployment, from social things. But also it's more than just, am I able to feed my family and provide for the future? And a bit of that kind of safety in the future. But also, speaking of Soviet legacy, this attachment to state paternalism that was very prominent in the first years of independence has begun to wane in Belarusian societies. We have surveys that show that a lot fewer people, for example, in 2016, thought that the state needs to have a great responsibility for people's well-being than there were in 1996. And since 2016, that number has dropped even further. So this attachment to the state as a kind of provider of all goods, all security, has begun to go. And this is because, Belarusian society changed. There's a new generation on the scene. And Lukashenko has not changed. So he's got older, if anything.
The story of change reminds me of my visit to Belarus right before the pandemic, 2019. The time has become really blurry. But I went to seek out the roots of my grandmother's saviors. She's Jewish and she was saved, Belarusian family, and they were descendants of the saviors. They're still alive, and they live in Garadok, which is translated as small town in English, outside of Vitebsk.
The name of the small town means small town.
Literally, yeah, it's Garadok. Yeah, it is a very tiny place, and I took a bus from Vitebsk to Garadok. There were a lot of drunk people in the bus station. It just looked very depressed. So the atmosphere felt so heavy, and the smell of alcohol and vodka was just unbearable. So I got into this little minivan, and I arrived there, and I was greeted by these descendants who were lovely people. And the town is, like I said, it's not much of a town. So they were very embarrassed that they can't take me to a restaurant. There was only one, but it's closed on Sunday, and there's not much going on. Not the time to go to the restaurant. So they greeted me very warmly, but they were quite aware of the lack of prospects and the fact that this place has not been developing very much for many, many years. And then as I was looking for my grandmother's old house, there's a specific location and everything. They told me that a few years ago, Lukashenko was supposed to visit. So they basically decided to take down all these old houses to impress him that there's there's new stuff happening. So kind of like the Potemkin village style, like resurrection. But he never came. So the house was demolished, but there was no reason for it. And there was a lot of cynicism that I sensed from people I spoke to, even in this little town, Garadok, about, leadership. And he's, of course, very far away from them. Minsk is quite far, but they still felt that kind of stagnation and lack of inspiration when it comes to their future. I remember that very strongly, this visit.
That's really interesting because, it's also a reflection of how much he's lost touch with those who were probably the most kind of ardent supporters of him in 1994. And for a long time, the government rhetoric to wave away the political opposition was to say, oh, it's just people in Minsk, who are detached, divorced from the reality of the whole country. And they're just the capital bunnies who don't know what they want, or they sold out to the West. And the 2020 protest showed that this isn't just Minsk, because there were mass demonstrations repeatedly in small towns, in villages, and all across the country, not just in Western Belarus, but in Eastern Belarus and all over. So, the economic decline that became to be very visible by 2019 even has just been so comprehensive that the disillusionment is palpable. And even on a short visit, you were able to kind of to see it, to feel it.
Yeah, this was before the movement. So this was a couple of years, just a little bit prior to what unfolded. But just to talk a little bit more about Belarusian society, since we talked a lot about Lukashenko, but the public itself, the people, there's kind of a stereotype, because we've been breaking down some of these notions like weak national identity or the Soviet legacy. Another stereotype that I often read about, also in ethnographic writings about Belarus, is that the Russian public is quite lethargic when it comes to political movements, and the forms of resistance documented in different studies that I assigned to my classes as well are very subtle and almost apolitical. For example, like people planting their own vegetable gardens outside of their homes, like dachas, and that became a form of creative expression and a way to define one's own freedom. But then, of course, we have this immense protests in 2020, 2021, mass movement, anti-regime uprising that encompasses segments of society that were otherwise seemingly deactivated and also coming from all over the country. So I wanted to probe a little bit deeper about how that came about. Did that surprise you as you were observing this? I'm sure you have friends and colleagues there. Did that movement come out of nowhere for you? Did you feel it coming for years as something that's kind of like a bubble that just burst, as we talked about all the conditions people suffered?
I think perhaps not for years, because Belarus had a long history of this kind of detachment from politics for a majority of people. It's not that they necessarily continued to embrace Lukashenko as a solution. They just disengaged from politics. They carved out a space for themselves to live, to function, to have families, to travel and to do their own thing. And until Lukashenko and the kind of Lukashenko in many guises, the flagging economy, the deteriorating living standards, and kind of loss of the sense of the future and dignity began to intrude on those things, they perhaps could continue to muddle through. And also, let's not forget that Lukashenko is not just a charming populist politician. His regime is highly repressive. He established kind of his credentials, if you like, as an authoritarian leader, not just by getting into scraps with parliament, but also by being implicated. His regime has been implicated in the disappearance of several prominent opposition politicians in the late 1990s, whose bodies have not been found to this day. And on a more popular scale, the participation in any kind of mass protests or demonstrations, even before 2020, could lead to very unpleasant encounters with the police, detention, fines, threats to your employment and so on. So this is an oppressive regime. Expressing opposition is not cost-free and never was under Lukashenko. So this has an ingrained habit, and the sense of hopelessness, contributed to that sense of hopelessness. You can't change things. But I think I began to get a sense that things were definitely different in the electoral campaign. And possibly, if I were a bit smarter, I would probably start noticing that things were changing in 2019, ironically during the pandemic, because that was the moment when, first of all, the regime demonstrated very sharply how incompetent and incapable it was of doing anything for society. So the state failed completely to protect, to inform, to respond adequately to the pandemic. And on top of that, kind of add insult to injury, Lukashenko came out publicly with this ridiculous advice: what to do if you catch a virus. And that was frankly bordering on offensive.
What was the advice? I forget what was the...
Oh, the advice was, take a shot of vodka and go to Banya,
right.
Ride on the truck.
Okay.
That's probably better than injecting yourself with bleach, to be fair.
At least you're not going to die from it.
Maybe he was getting to that.
Yeah, that's the next step. After the vodka, you go to sauna, then you have bleach.
But, he's talking to a population that's kind of 80% urban. What tractor are we talking about? So this was very vivid, very obvious. And the main point was that the society responded by self-organizing. So people kind of thought, right, well, we can't look up to them. We have to do it ourselves. So people fundraised, crowdfunded for protective equipment, PPE, for supplies, medical supplies. They organized to buy these supplies, to deliver them to hospitals using mobile phones and kind of channels on Telegram and so on. And the response was really incredible. So kind of civil society came together in 2019 and probably drew some lessons for the future, namely that social media can be used to organize movements. And these are the lessons that the protesters absolutely kind of applied in 2020 when they organized protests, when they informed people of police movements and basically kind of tried to outsmart the regime. I think that was the moment when, looking back on it, I think this was a pivotal moment. And then the election campaign of 2020, when suddenly society came alive and the opposition movement changed. There were new faces. There's three women, with Tikhanovskaya, Kolesnikova, and the third one standing kind of on the platform. And this was just so different from everything that had gone on in opposition movement before. And I think it inspired people as well. And then their rallies became so popular that it became clear that the entire society is galvanized and these elections are going to be different. And so when the results were announced, and the results were as stale and as obviously fraud as before. It just burst the bubble. And I think people got very angry and very, I suppose, indignant is the word that comes to mind, that they all just poured out into the street. And I remember, seeing streams of people going to the city center in Minsk to just be there and to register their protest against the lies. And also people gathering, for example, people who were less young and maybe, pensioners' age. They were gathering around their local voting station, demanding to see the results of their local voting station. So everyone was out, and it fueled this kind of sense of community and sense of power further. It was a very special moment, I think, in Belarus. And it's difficult to undo that moment, no matter how much kind of brutal violence you throw on it.
Was there a sense that the Lukashenko regime is corrupt, or is that not a part of the grievance that ordinary people have with the government?
Certainly, because one of the kind of early promises of the regime was that the government will protect the citizens from the corruption that was emerging around a version of capitalism in Russia. So oligarchs and,
And we're talking the 1990s when you're saying the very early years, yeah.
Exactly. So the worst when, the former apparatchiks or the former members of the Komsomol who were in the right place in the right time were able to take advantage of, Russian privatization scheme and enrich themselves. And there was a lot of connection with the crime, organized crime and so on. And so all of that was kind of part of the social contract that the Lukashenko government, who's built on the anti-corruption platform, will protect its people from. But obviously, as the decades went on, it became very clear that the biggest organized crime, mafia and corruption clan is the Lukashenko clan, is the family and the friends. And this kind of state-level corruption, which often led to the very top echelon of the power structure, became hard to hide and very obvious, and I think contributed to this kind of break of the social contract and disintegration of the social contract. So corruption was there as part of the grievances. And I suppose the voting results were another kind of symbol or symbolic manifestation of that corruption. The politics and economics merge into one, and both are murky.
Right. Murky indeed. Yeah, well, I don't need to draw the obvious comparisons with the United States. Can you explain why the uprising was sometimes called the Slipper Revolution and the Anti-Cockroach Revolution?
Because of Lukashenko's moustache. I mean, this is an example of, I'll explain how this is connected.
I'm trying to picture it. He does have a serious mustache.
He does have a serious moustache, which is amplified by his boldness.
Right, it stands out.
So he's mostly bald. I can't say fully bald, but he's mostly bald. And he used to kind of put a little long strip of hair from one side to the other to cover the baldness. And it looked terrible.
The worst strategy ever.
Worst strategy. And this eventually somebody told him, probably ever so quietly, talked about. But the moustache stays. And so he has moustache. And because of his moustache, he got this nickname Cockroach, right? Because cockroaches have long moustache. So
I didn't know that. Oh my God. I didn't pay attention. Oh my God.
The protests of 2020 and the pre-election campaign were hugely creative. Maria, you mentioned the different forms of political resistance. So art became a form of political resistance in Belarus. And these little memes and jokes and kind of slogans and posters that people drew on an A4 piece of paper and took with them to rallies. And this is incredible. And I know people are doing work on art of protest in Belarus. So it's a well-documented phenomenon. But this cockroach image was part of, kind of demystifying or I suppose decreasing the power of Lukashenko, if you like, in symbolic terms. He's only a cockroach. All we need is a good sleeper to whack him and we shall be free. Doesn't take much. And this links to another, you may have come across the kind of the 3% signs. They claim that he has the majority of popular vote. The elections turn out 80% of voters voting for him. This was completely ripped apart by people before the election, saying you only have support of 3%, partly stemming from the fact that, again, going back to this issue of digital savviness, so Belarusians organized a platform of alternative vote count for the elections in 2020, where people who wanted a change of regime, who wanted a change of things in the country, could go and vote as usual to the polling station, but then also go and register their vote anonymously on this platform, which would allow then for alternative counting to counter the lies, if need be, of the authorities. And there was also a kind of a pre-voting campaign saying, how do you intend to vote? Again, fully anonymous. And it turned out that only 3% were going to vote for Lukashenko. So kind of this 3% was everywhere in the protest saying, go, no one wants you here. You've got 3%. So cockroach revolution and slipper revolution, I suppose, refers to the one and only mustachioed ruler of Belarus.
With no hair.
With no hair.
Only the thick mustache. So in the end, the government has taken quite a harsh turn on this movement, despite this 3%, right, which is a really striking number if you think about it, just how few people really supported him. But the crackdown was really severe. Is this something, again, you anticipated when you were observing this, or is this kind of a new level of repression that emerged after this movement or alongside with it?
Yeah, violence, again, is a very important part of the story in Belarus. This was not the first time there were protests after elections, presidential elections, and this wasn't the first time violence was used. So a most relevant recent comparison was almost exactly 10 years ago, or 10 years before the 2020, rather, also presidential elections, when there was a protest demonstration immediately afterwards, and it was violently dispersed by the special police forces. But what happened in 2020 was on an entirely new scale. So the initial first few days of protests drew a very harsh response. Even the 2020 events did not quite prepare Belarusians for this. There was mass police violence. Police were violent not just in terms of dispersing demonstrations, but also they attacked passers-by, they attacked random people in shops. This was like some kind of occupational regime that suddenly descended on Belarusians. The police used rubber bullets, the police used batons. People who had been arrested in these 3 days immediately after the voting were subjected to torture in detention. It was very comfortable because the family members waiting outside the police stations or detention centers could hear people crying inside and screaming. It was like 3 nights and days of terror. And because Belarusians were all online, almost 80% of Belarusians used internet or were connected to internet, the information about this violence was spreading like fire on social media. And then when people started coming out of detention after whatever 2-3 days of torture and were posting photographs of their bruised bodies, these also went viral. And it is in response to this incredible violence, totally unprovoked and, totally unmerited. It's in response to that the mass protests began to happen, that every weekend there were hundreds of thousands of people coming out. And these demonstrations began to diminish in numbers because the police again began to produce a violent response to that. But they carried on until the end of the year. So quite a long period. It's not a matter of a few days or nights. It's been going on for months, these waves. But the very first mass protest, a week after the elections on Sunday, caught the authorities off guard, I think. And they a little bit lost the nerve before such enormous crowds. And this was a moment when, things changed in Belarus because the protests came out in huge numbers and they felt that they could change things. And the moods, the feeling of people was very, very special. It felt like for the first time in history, or certainly in recent history, Belarusians walked tall and looked each other in the eye and felt like a community.
Yeah, it was incredible to watch the movement from afar. And one of the fascinating discussions at the time was also about the role of the military, the police and the military in this conflict. So I think for a while there was some talk of maybe they're going to shift sides towards the protesters and kind of essentially betray the Lukashenko regime. But in the end, it didn't happen, right? So, or maybe some did, but not entirely. So how did you observe the military kind of role, complicity in this?
And can I just add a second part to that question, Natalya, which is like you talked about the initial brutal repression of the protests, but after that, how slow was the repression of opposition movements? Was it a slow grinding down or was it just a series of brutal acts?
Okay, so to answer first the question about the military and I guess switching sides, the final secret of the Lukashenko regime is that he's really cultivated and cemented his relationship with the police force and the military. And when everything else fails, when the social contract disintegrates, when the economy is not doing well, when the promises are not fulfilled, that's what he's falling back on. And it's true that some members of the force, or police force and the military, switched sides and went to the side of the protesters, but not in an en masse sort of way. That would have spelled the end of his regime for sure. But it hasn't happened, and the economic advantages and the carrots that keep them in the service of the regime held. So the police force, and especially the special force, the OMON, the anti-riot police, are particularly well paid and are given all kinds of perks. They're also often housed in, their own apartment blocks, right? That create that sense of community, which is very difficult to break away from. And the military, I suppose, find it attractive that all military action they have to do is fight unarmed, peaceful protesters, not any kind of real war. Thank God for that. But this is a very cushy position, and it helped. And once these people were implicated in the brutality and the violence against the protesters, from that point, it's very hard to leave and shift sides because, you literally have blood on your hands. So it's difficult to leave. And of course, the regime punished severely those who did try to switch sides, who left the force, who, wrote the application requests to quit or even joined this coordinating council of the opposition. Some people have been arrested and put in prison for a long time. Others had to flee. So the cost of leaving, of betraying the regime is high, whereas the benefit of staying and being implicated in the violence also high, if you can close your eyes and live with yourself up to that. But of course, that was a major disappointment because all these expectations of the system that Lukashenko built, giving cracks, did not materialize. There were some cracks, but they never widened enough to crumble the whole. So the repression that began almost the night after the elections and protests continues to this day. So grinding and ongoing, yes, it's still there. People are still being put before courts for a comment on social media or a participation in these protests 5 years ago, because the authorities now have identified their face and found their whereabouts on social media somewhere. New protests, they're coming out to support Ukraine or criticize Russia's war in Ukraine, immediately results in arrest and imprisonment. So the repression is ongoing. It's kind of been wiped off the front pages of newspapers now, but it doesn't mean it has stopped. And it was also brutal. I mean, from the very beginning, from the mass demonstrations, once the regime kind of recovered its balance after the first couple of these demonstrations, they began to kind of have an all-out violent response and arrests and going after people who have been implicated in any way in participation in this protest or have ever been politically active or involved in the opposition. So the usual means are charging people with crimes like extremism or gross violation of public order and sentencing them to lengthy prison sentences. And the courts have completely become kind of accomplices in this, in the regime. No court has acquitted anyone in these last 5 years. Whatever the evidence from witnesses, whatever kind of the defense arguments, whoever is charged usually goes to jail. So the judicial system, in the sense that we understand it, does not exist in Belarus. It is only an instrument of repression.
I'm not sure how we understand it anymore in this country.
Sure,
but...
Yes, that's true. That's true. But you still have, some institutional kind of resilience there.
Yes, there is still some left.
Which has been completely kind of destroyed in Belarus.
How important was Russia in helping Lukashenko reassert power over the protest movement?
Hugely important. Russia was the key because there was a moment which lasted from about August till early September when Putin hesitated. And because, as I mentioned, the relations were at an all-time low before the elections, to the point where Belarusian authorities arrested and therefore exposed some of Russian mercenaries having a break in Belarus on the way to assignments somewhere else, like Turkey, Syria. So the relations were at a very bleak point. Lukashenko accused Russia of meddling in the pre-electoral campaign and so on. And then the protests happen and Lukashenko is cornered. He can't turn to the West because the West is saying, talk to your opposition. Clearly, your people don't want you. As Lukashenko grovels to the Kremlin, he goes to Russia, he talks to Putin, he asks him for support. And eventually, not immediately, but eventually Putin gives this support. And it comes in shape of public support, so endorsing the Lukashenko regime. It comes in the shape of a whole contingent of Russian journalists who travel to Belarus to take place of those Belarusian journalists from state newspapers and state television who refuse to collaborate with the regime in the face of violence, who defect, if you like, from Lukashenko, who say, we don't want to lie anymore. And they have to be replaced. And it's the Russian journalists who do the job. And also in the form of financial support. So remember, those special police forces have to be paid handsomely for beating up peaceful protesters. The judges have to be paid handsomely for sentencing innocent people. So Russia offers the funding. And it is at this point that the protest movement finds itself in very difficult predicament. But also, I think this involvement of Russia and the fact that Russia really does now have Lukashenko at its mercy. So the Kremlin really can say, okay, well, we'll save you, but in return, we want something from you. And that's something, I think, was the joint military doctrine, which Belarus had refused to sign for many years. And in November 2021, lo and behold, they signed. And November 2021 is significant because then come the joint military exercise on the Belarusian border from which Russia attacks Kiev, right? Because it's close. So I think there is a clear line here where the desperation of the Lukashenko regime drove him into the arms of the Kremlin in a way it had never done before. And in return, he gave Russia his territory from which to attack Ukraine. So who knows if the full-on invasion of Ukraine would happen then and there had it not been for the events that preceded it in 2020.
It's quite a price to pay for helping to crush the protest movement.
It's quite a price, indeed.
Yeah. And to go back to, or to kind of fast forward to the current moment, you already hinted at pretty restrictive media control and censorship in Belarus, but also the attempts of the regime to erase the movement. In reflecting on a 5-year anniversary of the uprising, a recent German media report notes that even the digital traces of the uprising have been erased as if it's never taken place. Can you talk a little bit about this effort by Lukashenko government to erase this inconvenient but really massive political event? Has this happened before? And you also talked a little bit earlier that how it's impossible to erase it. So I wanted to kind of go back to your, if I understood it correctly, your line there that it's actually impossible to fully get rid of this history.
Yeah, I think I stand by that. I understand why the regime would want to attempt to do this. And in a way, it makes it easier that so many Belarusians had to flee and now live abroad and cannot counter the story by their presence. And of course, I mean, this goes back to a good old Soviet tradition of erasing political events or rewriting history in a way that is convenient. Or silencing certain parts of history. And in fact, one of the most important historical memories in Belarus today and in the Soviet times, the memory of the Second World War, is also a victim of such rewriting, silencing, whitewashing, the controversial role of the Soviet partisans, the collaborators, the story of Belarusian Jews, all of that.
This brings me back to that visit to my grandmother's hometown.
Right.
And it was a very, very cold, snowy day. And I had to go through this giant puddles of snow, like sugroba, in Russian, to get to this monument where they were commemorating, the victims. And then I get there and it says nothing about the Jews. It was just Soviet people, the people who were, resisted the Nazis, anti-Nazis, anti-fascist movements. But there was nothing about the Jews, even though that's the ground that I was standing on was literally underneath are all those bodies that were run over by trucks and murdered alive, buried alive, sorry. So those were the bodies of my grandmother's, parents as well, right under that monument. So it was really striking. And I was standing next to those saviors, descendants, and they said nothing. They thought it was normal. So I pointed at the monument. I was like, wow, that's really shocking. I was covered in snow, so I had to wipe it out and see what's underneath. And they just said, yeah, of course. I mean, it's a normal message. They were not struck by it in any way, even though their parents and grandparents helped to save the Jews. Yeah, it's like the Jews were never there. It was a really interesting experience, kind of shocking to see it like that physically, to witness it.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to experience that because someone said it's like being killed twice.
Yeah, it was very disorienting. And then, my grandmother is still alive and I had to kind of report back the facts of the trip. And yeah, it's hard for her to process fully that messiness as well, because she's very attached to Belarus and she's attached to Soviet legacies. So it's hard for her to say like, oh yeah, these people like, they did wrong when it comes to commemorating the history, because she feels very grateful to Belarusian people for saving her. So it's a very complicated entanglement. But yeah, that history is pretty much erased.
Yeah. So the Soviets did this inly, and of course, the history of the Jewish suffering in the Soviet Union has been completely, in the Soviet times, removed from public eyes. And exactly that, the victims were either innocent civilians or anti-fascists or partisans or the soldiers, Soviet people, but nothing specifically Jewish about it. And having said that, Belarus was probably the only place in the whole Soviet Union where there was one memorial to specifically Jewish victims in the Minsk Jewish ghetto, which was called the Pit. I don't know if you had a chance to visit it.
I have not visited that one. Yeah.
This is also interesting on Lukashenko, kind of a reflection on his regime, that this little monument was constructed there shortly after the war by people without consulting very much with the state or kind of, slipping through the cracks of state approval. But miraculously, and it was literally at the bottom of the pit where the Minsk ghetto Jews were executed, huge numbers, thousands of people. On one night, so something like 5,000 people killed. It's a terrible story. And at the bottom is that little sort of obelisk, very modest, with an inscription about what happened. And I can't remember, but I think I may be wrong, but I think at the time even there were two inscriptions in Russian and in Hebrew, I think. Not in Yiddish, but in Hebrew. Anyway, so this miraculously survived and was a site of commemoration for the families of people who knew, would come every year and take flowers and so on. But the authorities were clearly very uncomfortable with it, but they didn't destroy it. Then under Lukashenko, it took some time and he made some really unpalatable public statements about the Jews in Belarus, about Hitler, famously, sorts of things were said. And then suddenly he decided that he's going to, approve of all this commemoration and kind of actually bringing the Belarusian Jews into the picture of the story of the war. And the memorial of Yama was rebuilt and refurbished. And I'm not sure Lukashenko actually kind of proactively encouraged or supported it, but he wasn't in the way. He didn't stand in the way of it being remodeled. And now it's a proper memorial, right? It's still done in a form of a kind of indent or a pit with some grass growing at the bottom, but there are stone steps coming down to this memorial. And the memorial has been refurbished, I think, with the involvement of the Israeli community. And there's a very beautiful statue. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the artist who designed it, of a kind of a throng of people holding hands, looking at each other and descending into the pit. And these kind of very thin, moving figures of real life size, not big or small, but you can stand next to them and feel that there's a real people and there's someone playing a fiddle. So it's a really moving, powerful symbol. But I always look at it as a symbol of resilience, of memory, that despite all odds and all the erasure, it's somehow through the kind of sheer will of and the commemoration of individuals, right? So I don't think Lukashenko will succeed with erasing the memory of the largest protest moment in a revolution that's unfinished, but nevertheless was a revolution.
But may I ask, in terms of the way he tries, the tools at his disposal are what? Is media control? Does Belarus have a kind of a great firewall censoring the internet? How does he attempt to manipulate the sort of information environment of Belarusians?
Lukashenko discovered what a smartphone is in 2020 when the protesters were using, social media channels like Telegram and so on to organize themselves. So since then, the authorities tried to use technology to block internet, to influence the content of websites, or to block websites that seem to be offering content to readers that's unpalatable to the regime. They have become quite good at technology in that sense. So the security services are using sophisticated facial identification equipment, which I believe was supplied to them by the United States years before. But I'm not sure of that. And to identify people who were involved in protests, to identify basically opposition and track them. But it is a massive effort to influence the digital space, usually by blocking it or kind of by isolating. The users of internet space have since come up with equally clever ways of circumventing these blocks or of equipping their phones and their social media with VPNs that protect them from intrusion or protect them from being tracked or traced. So it's a kind of digital race or technological race of who could do home. But it's also in human memory because these events and these protests, as I said, were taking place across the country in smallest of settlements and where people were involved, and saw them and have seen them. So it's hard to kind of say, no, you didn't see it. Or what you saw was something else. Just as, the memory of how the war really was may not have been expressible in the Soviet times, but nevertheless was in living memory.
Natalia, can I ask on, a slightly different tack? Belarus is in a very interesting geographic position. It's stuck between Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. It seems almost to be at the fulcrum, upon which the history of Europe for the rest of the century might turn. How important is its geographic location to the way we should try and think about Belarus?
I want to say it is important, but I don't want us to think of Belarus as being a prisoner of its geography, because there are always so many other forces at play for a particular country and the kind of choices it makes. Because it's always been said that Belarusian location at the kind of the fault lines of major empires was a curse because it meant that it kept being run over. It was a bit of a ping pong ball in geopolitical games of these great powers and had seen a lot of violence, which is true in its history. But at the same time, I think there are advantages of being located at this kind of crossroads, to use the cliche, of various paths and various connecting points between different countries and different cultures. And it's only a question of, taking advantage of this. But I do think that Belarus matters in the geopolitical situation that we have in Europe today. And just as the full-on invasion by Russia of Ukraine was predicated on the political situation in Belarus, and I think there's connection equally, I think the solution to the problem might also be in Belarus. And Belarus tends to be, I think, a little bit kind of given up on by policymakers because it's under Russia's heel and we can't get them out of there. They've always been under Russia's heel. Actually, I think weaning Belarus from Russia would deal a blow to Russian sort of geopolitical self-confidence, because they always had Belarus. And if everything else fails, and if Ukrainians are being stubborn and don't want Russian world somehow, then at least we have Belarusians. But if Belarusians were to leave and to say, you know what, we don't like what you're doing. I know it sounds weak in the moment when, we're talking about long-range ballistic missiles, but I think it would deal a very important psychological blow in Russia. And I think this is a situation where we can't afford not to try everything. And so Belarus is, I think, important in this geopolitical conflict, and we can't afford to ignore it.
Yes, speaking of not ignoring it, if we think about contemporary opposition that's still well alive, but coming and operating out of exile, much of the dissent operates from Europe, as far as I know. And how do you see the significance of this dissent outside of the borders of Belarus in challenging the regime? One of our previous guests, Maria Lipman, who studies Russia and Russian media, suggested that exile media, for instance, from Russia, was always bound to fail as a significant cultural and political force, because she sees it as just too disconnected from Russian audiences. And of course, some Belarusian media is also operating from the exile. How do you see this politics from the outside, the voices from the exile?
Well, there has always been some opposition abroad and in exile, but it's now on a completely different scale because so many people had to flee Belarus. They were not in opposition before when they lived in Belarus. They were swept up in the protest, and it became too difficult or dangerous for them to stay, or some had been in jail and were released and realized this wouldn't be the end of it and left. So we now have so many Belarusians living abroad in forced exile. We're talking about hundreds of thousands from a country which only has 10 million, possibly less now, that I think this has become a qualitatively different force. And of course, these people still have very close connections back home. And the nature of opposition changed. We have, of course, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team and the coordinating council, which are operating on the political level, and they're doing important work in keeping conversation about Belarus alive in European political circles in the EU and also in the US and Canada and so on, and other places in the world. But also this presence of other people, the more ordinary people that may not have access to presidents and leaders, but nevertheless do a lot of work, on social media, fundraising, helping people back home, but also those who are like them who are forced to leave abroad. A lot of creativity is happening. I think all of that matters and is not just a sign of defeat. It's a force that keeps not just the memory, which is also important, but also the kind of the bubbling activity of the resistance going. And also we have to be honest, opposition in Belarus is not possible right now internally. The powers and kind of on the side, the strength is on the side of the authorities, and the authorities have absolutely no compunction using the force in the most brutal way. So it's just not an equal fight in that sense. But it doesn't mean that what is happening abroad is waste of time or waste of effort. I think it's very important and needs to continue. And it will continue. It doesn't depend on our approval. It will just go on.
And in comparison to the Russian opposition groups, seems like a lot of them are in conflict with each other. There's a lot of tension in the Russian exile community, both amongst, the media people, but also politicians and different voices that just seem to strongly dislike each other, to say the least. So there's always kind of this disunity and fractures in like Russian opposition movement, even from, when they were operating within Russia. Do you see something similar when it comes to Belarus, or is this community, given the small population of Belarus as well, is it fairly united in exile? Like there's a strong sense of cohesion, or are there also kind of factions and divergent voices that might kind of split it apart if there is a chance at some point to actually return, if a crisis happens or there's a moment of opportunity?
Yeah, well, I think in politics, there's always going to be people with, egos who think that their way is the way, and it's quite normal. I think debating and discussing, there comes a point when this sort of diversity or disagreements become an obstacle, sure. But I think I'm not that familiar with Belarusian opposition to know the complete inner workings. And I'm sure there are tensions between some groups. But I think this was, from the beginning, the nature of Belarusian opposition and the successfulness of Belarusian opposition in 2020, before the crackdown, was in that they were united by a common goal to get rid of Lukashenko and to have a change of regime. And I know it sounds like an insufficient goal. And sometimes they were criticized for not having, a program of action for what to do next when they do successfully get rid of Lukashenko. But I think actually for the moment and for their purposes, I understand that priority. It meant that there were no debates or disagreements about what to do next. There was a kind of agreement of let's take it one step at a time. The difficult challenge is to create an open field. And then in that open field, we can have debates and conversations and elections and contested kind of contest of political ideas. But the response of the authorities, I think, only made that clearer. I'm sure, that there are very different visions of what the future of Belarus should look like. But it's almost irrelevant to talk about that now, because what you need is a clear strategy of how to affect the change of the regime. You mentioned a crisis or something comes along. There was a very brief moment when in Russia, the Wagner coup or attempted coup.
Yeah, I remember that. It's very exciting.
That opportunity, and, Belarusian opposition kind of went, full readiness alert, but it didn't happen.
And you're saying nobody has a clear strategy for making it happen at this point?
For making it happen from scratch, I've not seen such a strategy of saying, this is what we need to actually single-handedly, without anyone's help, evict Lukashenko, because behind Lukashenko, there's Kremlin. So effectively, you're saying they need to have a strategy to evict Putin.
Which is nobody has figured out so far. It's the $1 million question. Yeah.
The population of Belarus is very small, 9 million or so you mentioned. And that makes me think it's almost, in some ways, has an outsized role in the world right now for such a small population. How different does that make the political dynamics and the mechanisms of authoritarian rule? If you compare, say, to Russia, which is like 195 million people, or China, obviously 1.4 billion, or Trump's America, the incipient authoritarian regime here, where we have 380 million people. Is it?
Well, I suppose it makes it a little bit easier to manage, I suppose, for Lukashenko, because there's a smaller pool from which threats and opposition can emerge. At the same time, and if you antagonize sufficiently the population, it doesn't matter if there are only 9 million. But the difficulty of knowing, and this goes back to the question of opposition's plan, do they have a plan? I think they have strategies of a slow erosion of the regime. And I think the leadership, well, the younger generation of the opposition are keen to focus on the work of re-educating the population, so reaching out to those back in Belarus and trying to work with them and find ways of perhaps passive resistance or just not succumbing to the propaganda that the regime is producing, or the oblivion of the protest that the regime is keen to impose. And I think when you're dealing with a much larger audience like Russia or the United States, these campaigns are hard to sustain. And of course, the difference, a huge difference between Belarus and Russia at the moment in terms of how society responds to the war. So in Belarus, even those who are made peace with Lukashenko or kind of accepted that he's still staying, they are not interested in going and fight in Ukraine. So there's an overwhelming rejection of Belarus armed involvement in that, whereas Russia is, of course, very different. And it's also very difficult to say at the moment what Belarusians in Belarus are thinking in any kind of meaningful numerical statistical way, because sociological studies and opinion polls are prohibited. So banned. No one can ask anyone. And of course, even if there are those who, like Chatham House, try to gauge the opinion of ordinary Belarusians from abroad, methodologically it's very difficult, because how do you know people are not afraid and are not telling you the things that they think will them safe? It's very difficult to know what the population think, and therefore difficult to work. But one thing that is clear is that it's a very anti-war society, and that's also predicated on their experience in the Soviet Union.
Very interesting. As we're concluding, to turn our gaze to the realities here in America, where both Jeremy and I are based, as a historian observing what's happening here, at least, hearing about it and reading from afar, how do you interpret the authoritarian shift we're experiencing here in America? Like, has something come to mind that reminds you of your studies of the Soviet Union, the legacies, Belarus, or is it something completely different to you as you're watching us crumble?
One kind of lesson we can take out of this is that authoritarian regimes and leaders get lazy and they don't keep pace with change. And this is what brought Lukashenko into a corner in 2020. Of course, the United States is different because, it does have a system of democratic institutions that apply some brakes and controls. Not that Trump isn't trying to challenge that. But he's limited in his terms as president. And so I would say, look out for changes to constitution. Don't let those happen. This is how, in Belarus and in Russia, presidential powers were extended. As you said, Jeremy, Lukashenko had a sort of referendum, which was much disputed, but nevertheless lifted all limits on his presidential terms. But I think it's also dangerous to attribute such shifts, towards authoritarian to the right, to one person alone. However present that person is on social media. It's also a question of society. And I can see, as in Belarus, as in other places, the US society is polarized. A considerable part is taken by Trump's rhetoric. So I think it's key to maintain kind of open conversation, keep the other side engaged in conversation and debate. At least you have the institutions of free speech and press. And so these debates can be brought into the open, which is very healthy. In Belarus, this was all swept under the carpet, independent media was struggling. So I think focusing on just one person and just kind of one authoritarian leader is dangerous. We need to understand what made that leader possible, what made people vote for him. But I'm sure this is no news to you. I'm not revealing anything magical.
It's very difficult to think about what we're going through here in the United States. So it may not be news exactly, but it's very useful for us to have ways of understanding and framing the way we're thinking about what's happening. So perfect.
Thank you so much, Natalya, for this incredibly insightful conversation. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters.
Thank you so much, Natalya.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been wonderful talking to you guys. Thank you.